Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. This topic couldn't be more relevant today as both presidential candidates have signaled a strong willingness to use trade policy tools to counter the CCP's non-market behavior, which, as we know, greatly impacts critical mineral supply chains. Additionally, ongoing international discussions with allies and resource-rich countries, some of which straddle across administrations, underscore the importance of creating resilient and diversified supply chains that can stand the test of geopolitical shifts. Today's conversation is centered around the findings from SAFE's new released report, Trading Tensions, which evaluates the strategic importance of critical minerals, especially those used in batteries and electric motors or their alternative inputs. We used EV supply chains as a case study, but obviously beyond these inputs, critical minerals are the backbone of modern technology, powering everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to advanced defense systems and renewable energy infrastructure. Our report delves into the challenges and opportunities that exist within the critical minerals for EV supply chains, particularly the need to diversify sources and reduce reliance on geopolitical adversaries. Policies obviously do not exist in silos, and this report emphasizes the interconnected nature of trade measures across sectors. We examined case studies of trade policies on other commodities and other clean energy applications, as well as historic trade policies on ICE vehicles, all to inform our analysis and recommendations. Similarly, we believe the findings of this report can be extrapolated to a wide range of mineral-intensive products or their mineral substitutes, highlighting how supply chain dynamics in one area can and does influence broader economic and national security outcomes. This report emerged out of findings from the Mineral Center's seminal report, A Global Race to the Top. We've made many strides in the US EV and battery production, but our supply chains for key mineral inputs remain stubbornly concentrated, leading to a race to the bottom, where opaque supply chains favor lower-cost producers who tend to disregard labor and environmental standards. We argue in that seminal report that high-standard supply chains equal diverse supply chains equal secure supply chains. The trade report released today evaluates the degree to which trade policies can contribute to meeting that goal. So for today's webinar, we'll start with Zoe Oysel, the lead author on our report, alongside Jocelyn Traynor. Zoe will take us through the report's findings and recommendations. Then we will bring in our expert trade panel, moderated by New York Times journalist Anna Swanson, to discuss the real-world implications of these findings and explore the path ahead to ensure the United States can secure minerals in a way that supports economic growth, technological advancement, and national security, while not losing sight of important high environmental and social standards. Thank you again for joining us. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Zoe. Zoe is a senior policy analyst at SAFE's Mineral Center and the true brains of the operation. Zoe, the floor is yours to kick off a lively and insightful discussion, starting with your report findings.
Thank you, Abigail. Well, let's start with the current state of the play, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. You can see that the supply concentration for critical minerals extraction and refining on the screen. And in the mining side, a handful of countries extract most of this global supply, but concentration is most striking when it comes to the refining step. China refines 65 to 90% of the world's critical minerals. It also produces over 90% of cathode and anode materials, along with 70% of lithium-ion batteries. China's dominance in the critical mineral supply chain is not accidental. There are two factors at play, which Abigail already outlined for us. First, the CCP's decades-long coordinated policies, including subsidies, concessional loans to build domestic capacity and acquire strategic foreign assets and technologies. And second, the opacity of these supply chains, which make it nearly impossible to trace minerals' origins. This advantages actors who face less scrutiny when it comes to their environmental and labor practices. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and other US policies are already driving a rapid growth in the US battery and EV manufacturing space. However, we have few mining projects under development and still face supply chain gaps when it comes to the processing of critical materials and production of components like battery permanent magnets, cathode and anode materials. Trade remains essential for securing reliable access to these inputs. As Abigail outlined, three trade policy goals emerge from the challenges that we face. And you see them listed in a question format. But if we go through a list, it's de-risking through diversifying, which is especially important in the upstream, supporting domestic manufacturing along the value chain with a particular focus on downstream facilities that are already operational today, and overall upholding high standards that not only reflect our values as a nation, but also create a more level global playing field. The Minerals Center, with support from the Georgetown Trade Lab Practicum, conducted a detailed analysis of a number of trade tools to assess how well they address the 3 policy goals I outlined. And here you see a summary graphic. While most policies effectively address 1 or 2 of these policy goals directly, they rarely achieve all 3 simultaneously. If I'm to give a couple examples, import prohibitions like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act effectively promote higher standards, but can also restrict US access to materials in the downstream. While tariffs can create advantages for domestic producers in the US market, they don't really address the underlying factors like high capital costs, permitting delays, energy prices that make US producers less competitive at the global scale. Trade arrangements and trade agreements and trade preference programs that you see on the right may address de-risking indirectly, but their main focus are the other 2 goals. However, depending on the future enforceability of these agreements, especially for critical minerals agreements, there may be some inherent tension between expanding domestic supply and access to inputs and maintaining high standards. Excuse me. Already through this analysis, you see these trade-offs emerging, which I will more clearly outline in the next slide. And policymakers will need to carefully navigate and balance these challenges and trade-offs. I already talked about the first tension, how most of the time we can't achieve all 3 objectives at the same time. The second challenging question is a question of embedded materials. Policies that target specific products from specific countries may be easier to implement, but may also be easier to circumvent given the global complex nature of critical mineral supply chains. Take the solar industry as an example. US tariffs on Chinese panels led manufacturers to simply route production through Southeast Asia. Given the difference between the US and allied tariffs on Chinese battery materials, we may see battery materials similarly being circumvented through other countries and even our close allies. An alternative policy to address embedded materials is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act-like policies that try to cover the whole value chain, but these need greater supply chain transparency for effective implementation. The third challenge we face in this space is the need for better policy alignment between US and our strategic allies that are active at different supply chain nodes to help with the circumvention problem of embedded materials. But recent negotiations like the Global Arrangement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminum show that the negotiation of these agreements can be challenging when allies have different priorities or approaches to trade policies. Fourth, the choice between supporting domestic industries and promoting foreign sources is often presented in policy debates as an either-or option. However, they're not mutually exclusive. Given urgent material needs and lengthy mine development timelines, we need both the international partnerships and the domestic projects for resilient supply chains. These challenges and trade-offs that you see on the screen show that trade policies on their own can only go so far. Ultimately, successful resource-focused trade policy hinges on robust diplomacy with allies and strategic partners, and must also align with broader strategies to enhance US economic competitiveness at the global scale. Based on these findings, we recommend a 3-pronged approach in our report. First, we need to focus on enhancing the effectiveness of our existing policies, especially our unilateral measures like import prohibitions, tariffs, and export controls, before we consider new ones. Top recommendations on this front include steps to promote supply chain transparency and taking stock of existing siloed tools that address labor, environmental, and human rights concerns separately to see how these policies work together in a coherent fashion, and identify any gaps that remain that might warrant further policy action. The second prong is strengthening international cooperation to level the global competitive playing field. Sector-specific trade agreements with allies and strategic partners combined with frameworks to promote transparency and capacity building when needed, will be important to lay the groundwork for a race to the top. And here you see a list of countries, especially in the global south, that would really benefit from such engagement. Additionally, the United States should also collaborate with allies to coordinate on unilateral policies that impact market demand signals and the flow of goods, starting with tariffs. The final the final recommendation and prong that we see is the need for complementary policies to really address the trade-offs that we're facing. These policies include targeted incentives to bolster domestic and allied production capacity, as well as commercial diplomacy to complement trade policies, with a special focus on the upstream and midstream projects. I'll stop here and give it back to Abigail to kick off our panel discussion.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm actually going to turn it over to Anna, our moderator, to kick off the conversation.
Hi, thank you so much. I am delighted to be here. My name is Anna Swanson, and I cover international trade for the New York Times. And today we have a really fantastic panel of top experts in trade and critical minerals to talk about this topic. So I'm delighted to have Sarah Stewart, the Chief Executive Officer of Silverado Policy Accelerator, with us. Also Kellyanne Shaw, a partner at Hogan Lovells, and Jennifer Hillman, a professor at Georgetown University Law Center and a former member of the WTO appellate body. So the report is obviously very focused on trade tools and solutions, but I think it's important to set the table first by explaining what the problem is. Zoe definitely laid some great groundwork for that with her presentation, but I wanted to ask our panelists to do the same initially. So for everyone, what do you see as the most pressing challenges and gaps in current U.S. trade policy approaches to critical minerals? And why don't we go to Jennifer Hillman first? Thanks.
Well, fantastic, and thank you. And I just want to say a huge kudos to the folks at SAFE for producing this really amazing report. A tiny little shout out to my Georgetown students that had a little bit of a role in it. So to Cy Baker and Grant Black and Nikolai Medish, again, I think they did a lot of work to provide some of what is undergirding a little bit of this report. So I'm very pleased to be here. So for me, I mean, honestly, I step back from it and say we basically don't have a trade policy in critical minerals. And again, that this report and this whole session is trying to think about why, what to do about that. But for me, it is stepping back and thinking about why don't we have a trade policy for critical minerals right now, sort of today in the US market. And to me, it's a number of reasons. One is we don't have a domestic industry for much of the supply chain for critical minerals. The United States lacks midstream processing capabilities, so we are not a direct importer of critical minerals. What we are doing is importing batteries and motor components and EV battery cells. But the fact that we do not have a domestic industry for much of the supply chain is part of the reasons why we haven't seen more trade policy, more trade tools being brought to bear. The second thing for me is exactly where Zoe was talking about, which is it is really hard for a single trade tool to address a situation where you have multiple goals. And clearly in the critical minerals area, we have multiple goals. We, on the one hand, want to develop our domestic industry. So that's kind of one goal, but we clearly want to develop a domestic industry that is also supportive of trade that is done in both an environmentally friendly way and with appropriate controls around labor issues. So again, that's sort of one goal. And on the other hand, we really do have this competition over how do we diversify our supply chain and also bring transparency in. And the problem, again, is that there's no one trade tool that's going to solve that. But to me, kind of the good news on this is that there are imports from only a limited number of countries. That's the good and the bad, which means we only need to reach agreements with a handful of countries in order to really have a robust enough system in place to try to think about using trade and trade tools to address each of those multiple goals. I mean, if you think about it, we really need to work out arrangements with a limited number, and that will take us a long way towards towards meeting those goals. So I will stop there with just kind of, beginning with we need a trade policy with respect to critical minerals, and we don't have them, and the reasons why we don't have them is part of what we really need to focus on.
Great. Yeah, that's a fantastic overview. Sarah, maybe you could go next with some of your thoughts on what the challenges are.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Anna, and thank you, Abby and the SAVE team. Congratulations on an excellent report. It's funny, not going to be a full echo chamber, but the first thing written in my remarks is we have no comprehensive trade policy to address critical minerals. So I couldn't agree more with Jennifer on that. Let me take a little bit of a different tack for the rest of the answer, though. I think it is really stunning to think that we don't have a comprehensive trade policy on this when 4 years ago, the administration did do a pretty lengthy supply chain report identifying this as one of 4 areas where we are highly at risk to foreign entities of concern, including countries like China. I would also point out critical minerals are indispensable as an upstream input to not just, electric vehicles, but also to semiconductors, to wind turbines, to military aircraft, to defense systems. And I want to underscore this point. Without certain critical minerals, there are some downstream goods we actually cannot produce. So it is that important that we figure out a strategy for, if not producing these minerals ourselves and processing ourselves, that we have the right framework in place for figuring out who we're going to get it from. And we are very behind on that. I want to give an example. If you think about semiconductors, we just put tens of billions of dollars into that sector to build out new fabrication facilities. And these are going to be chips that support, everything from the clean energy transition and electric vehicles to many, many other things. We have not figured out the upstream piece of this. And there are a lot of critical minerals on that USG list that are absolutely critical to making those chips, and where we have 100% net import reliance, with the overwhelming majority of production of those minerals and processing of those minerals taking place in China, which is a country where we are not, our relations are icy at best, and where trade frictions are continuing and in a lot of ways escalating. We're also barreling towards 2050 net zero goals that's going to require a lot more critical minerals without a strategy. And with so much at stake, it seems sort of startling that we don't have a way of mapping out how trade policy can be can solve for some of these issues. I would say trade policy is probably one of the most powerful tools, and yet one of the most underutilized tools that we have at the moment. And I will close just by quickly offering that the reason why I think trade policy is so important is because it can be a foundation for identifying the problem and objectives that we need, prioritizing the minerals where we're most at risk, creating a framework for which partners that we're going to enter into agreements with, figuring out what are the standards that we're going to judge agreements with partners on, whether it's labor or environment or others. And we have a myriad of trade tools to choose from, both carrots and sticks. So I would say next administration, first on the docket needs to be comprehensive trade policy.
Great. And to Kellyanne, Sarah makes a great point that obviously we have spotlighted this as a national issue for a while as a national risk. Why do you think the problem is still so acute for the United States?
Sure, and I will also echo my congratulations to the SAFE team for a terrific report. I think they've laid out a number of policy proposals and really reviewed the whole landscape of trade policy and have given us all some interesting food for thought in terms of addressing some of the challenges. But let me start with the challenges. Like, what are we actually talking about here? And this may be obvious to everyone in the audience, but just to start with the basics, like what are critical minerals and why are we talking about them? It's actually an interesting question because the definition of critical minerals changes depending on which country you're in and over which time period you're looking at. So critical minerals, just by their definition, are non-fuel minerals that are essential to U.S. national security and economic security interests, have supply chain vulnerability that are vulnerable to disruptions, and then 3, serve an essential function in manufacturing of products, the absence of which would have significant consequences for U.S. economic and national security, which is a very mouthful way of saying these are elements that are vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, particularly from adversaries like China, Russia, and others, but essential for so much production that happens in the United States. So the United States, we have 50 elements that have been identified as critical minerals. The European Union, for example, has 34, and just a few years ago, the U.S. had only identified 35. So this is something that is changing as our economic and national security needs change as well. And so what's the problem? Well, critical minerals and rare earth elements, they aren't actually that rare. You can find them pretty much around the world to varying degrees. But the question is, can you find them in a significant commercial amount such that it makes sense to extract them from that geography? And that's a question of geology. Some critical minerals only exist in China, or they only exist in Russia, or they only exist in certain places. So that's one challenge that the United States has to address. The other piece of it is the processing. So even if you could find other places to source minerals besides China, right now China processes about 85% of all critical minerals on Earth. And that is a step in the production that causes some pretty significant environmental impacts, which is why you don't see a lot of other countries raising their hand to say, we'll process here. So that's another challenge. Another challenge is the fact that we don't really have a robust recycling program. So the number one source of critical minerals right now is actually everyone's junk drawer. It's that old iPhone or iPod or laptop that you don't use and stick back there. And many of those minerals can actually be extracted through recycling, but right now it's very expensive. Very few people actually take their electronic goods to be recycled. And there are some elements for which recycling just is not a viable option either. And then sort of the last piece of this I will raise is this concept of substitution. And I sort of joke, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a scientist. But that said, when you look at the periodic table, there are some elements that you can substitute for one another. And the closer they are within the periodic table, the more substitutable they are. But there are some drawbacks. So you take EV battery technology, which SAFE has looked into. There's NMC technology for batteries, which uses cobalt. Cobalt is primarily sourced from the DRC. However, there are some human rights and child labor concerns about that. So there's an effort to transition away. But cobalt's function within an electric vehicle battery is to stabilize it and make sure that when you're driving, it doesn't spontaneously combust, right? So it's got a huge safety element. And so trying to find the right way to substitute that, it takes a lot of research and development. So when we're thinking about trade policy tools, there's a lot that we can do in that space, but I just wanted to highlight the different challenges along the supply chain that any policymaker is going to have to grapple with in terms of trying to make sure that we do have access to secure and resilient supply chains for critical minerals.
Fantastic. Great. Sarah, I wanted to go to you next. So Zoe talked about some of the trade-offs and competing priorities in her presentation that crop up when we're considering this issue. There are national security concerns about who you source these minerals from. There are a lot of economic competitiveness concerns that relate to how available these minerals are for downstream industries. And then there are a variety of concerns over values and norms, whether that's about human rights, the use of child labor, potentially forced labor in these supply chains, or the impact that mining or processing these minerals might have on the environment. So that's a lot of priorities to balance. How do you think we should attempt to try to balance those? Is it possible? And if not, how do you choose between those priorities?
I think this is a great question. I think many of the issues that come up in modern day are going to have competing priorities between national and economic security, geopolitical issues, labor and environment standards. So I don't think that this one is unique, but that doesn't make it any less easier to solve. And the trade-offs here are real. I think that we can't just have one primary goal. We have to proceed with multiple objectives, and we have to try and find that balance, even though it's not going to necessarily be, be pretty or easy. But trade policy can be, I think, nimble enough to deal with some of the things that we're talking about. So a couple of sort of ideas that, I would put out there for the audience to think about. When I think about trade policy and trade tools, I think about carrots and sticks. I think about incentivizing tools like entering into agreements with partners that increase trade and investment. That's exciting. People want to do that. It's good for economics. It's good for jobs. I think about incentivizing tools being reduction of tariff and non-tariff barriers so that trade can go more smoothly. Maybe sometimes it's technical assistance for developing countries to, help them climb the ladder and do more. And we see a lot of that bear out in free trade agreements and more recently in, critical minerals agreements and other trade arrangements. We also have disciplining tools, and those are the tools that we can use, for example, to deal with subsidies that are market distorting and unfair, or with dumped prices that are, depressing prices in the global market and making, rattling investors and making U.S. producers, profits go up and down with not a lot of predictability. So there's a lot of different ways that we can use trade policy and trade tools to get at some of the objectives that we have. So with that background, I think when we look at, for example, the need for immediate action to create resiliency in this system, we're doing a lot of stuff that's outside of the trade realm through domestic investment at home and partnership with allies, but our trade tools can be a real complement to this. So think about if you're making a domestic investment here, maybe with money from the IRA, or you've got DPA funds from the Defense Department, but then the prices for the mineral that you're looking to produce tank because China is setting them and has asymmetrical, disproportionate influence in the supply chain. You need something that's going to protect you there. And I would argue trade policy would be a way of dealing with that particular issue, but that is part of this broader objective of having production at home, being more resilient, figuring out how to wean ourselves off of China in particular. Another example here is, we've got to figure out how to prioritize where we're the most at risk. And this is very difficult. But if we think about what are our national defense priorities and what are the minerals that we have that support those priorities and how are we going to address those? Again, trade tools can be one of the fastest, most immediate ways of changing supply chains and digging in with partners. So, again, it's sort of addressing like a bunch of different objectives at one time. And finally, I would just say trade tools are a way of getting at the who and the how. So we need a framework of who we're going to work with on these issues. Jennifer mentioned it's really just a handful of countries, but it's enough of a debate of how exactly we should go about that we need a framework. Are we going to choose countries that have low environment and labor standards and make the trade-off that we need supply from them, but yet, they haven't quite met where we want to be in terms of ambition in those areas? Trade policy can be a carrot and a stick to help drive that. We've seen it happen before. There's lots of different examples. So that's the who, and then of course the how on, how are we going to go about, the production and processing of these minerals. And again, here, trade tools can help us figure out not just how we're going to produce something, but the standards that, we can put out there for different trading partners to understand what labor standards we're expecting, what environment standards we're expecting, and then, being able to hold feet to the fire. So lots of different objectives, but trade policy is very nimble, and allows us to sort of address all of them at one time.
Great. Kellyanne, let's go to you next. So you have a background not just in private practice at Hogan Lovells, but also as a government official. I wanted to ask your thoughts about what is, kind of the most effective domain for some of these efforts to happen in. So do you think the United States should be prioritizing unilateral measures that it can take by itself, given the complexity of, coordinating, or should it be working coordinating with key allies or working under in international forums like the WTO? How do you compare those possibilities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the truth is, the answer is all of the above and all at the same time. There is no silver bullet when it comes to critical minerals and sort of all the elements of the supply chain we talked about, from mining to processing to recycling to research and technological developments regarding all of these phases in the supply chain, right? So it takes a whole of government approach in the United States, and it takes a whole of allied approach in terms of working with partners. So, just a couple of ideas and thoughts, right? I think, and some of these were highlighted in the report itself from SAFE. So using the UFLPA as an example is one way to go in terms of like putting transparency as one of the top goals for addressing this challenge. Because it's one thing to think about importing directly critical minerals and looking at the source countries for them. It's another to take something like your cell phone or some other consumer good or dual use technology that incorporates some of these critical minerals from different places and then put some parameters on that. So requiring companies in the private sector to really understand their entire supply chain. The other sort of example we have that I think has worked relatively well, just operating in the private sector and advising a lot of automotive companies on the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. So both of them have this concept of foreign entity of concern. And it doesn't really get at the physical property of where that good was produced and then transformed. It gets at the ownership structure of every entity in the supply chain. So for example, if you've got a lithium mine in Indonesia that is owned or controlled by a Chinese company, the Chinese government still has the ability to hit the off button and to basically stop you from obtaining the critical minerals at a time when you need them. So they're not physically located in China, but there's a Chinese ownership or control element to it, right? So getting at the ownership and control and getting at like the physical property of where those have been in the supply chain requires what's called changes to the rules of origin. And that's a pretty fundamental shift in the way that we would trade with pretty much every nation on earth. But if the United States could negotiate with allied countries, whether they're NATO members, Five Eyes, other like-minded allies who have certain critical minerals and want to create a market where you have very tight rules of origin that basically would require all actors in that supply chain to not source from anything owned or controlled by China or Russia or another country that we don't think is going to be particularly friendly. Like that's one way to effectively use trade policy, looping in other countries to do the same. And then sort of on the other side of it, like if you want to mine, if you want to process in the United States, like that's going to take a lot of permitting, that takes a lot of domestic work, tax incentive structures. So all of these things have to operate together at the same time. But what I would say was probably at this point in time, the least effective would be going through the multilateral system. I don't personally see the WTO as capable of addressing this challenge, nor do I see the UN or a number of other of international fora. I think it's going to take a new approach among a smaller group of countries to do so, but some creative thinking is definitely required. Thanks.
Great. Jennifer, I would love to get your take on that. I mean, do you see the WTO as capable of responding to this? Kellyanne mentioned the requirements in the IRA and CHIPS being a fundamental shift in the way that we trade with other nations. And this seems like potentially just the beginning of what's needed. So how do you see the actions that the United States is taking and will take in the critical mineral space affecting the global trade conversations and norms, and particularly institutions like the WTO.
So let me just start by saying, do I think the WTO is going to come along to the rescue and within the next year work out, a global agreement on critical minerals that'll satisfy everybody? Clearly not. But I may be one of the few left in Washington that believes that some adherence to the WTO rules and at least a willingness by the United States to try to adopt whatever its critical minerals trade policy is with those obligations in mind is still worth doing. I mean, why do I say that? In part because I don't think adopting a policy that is just a wholesale violation of the WTO is in the United States' interest. I mean, it basically is telling the rest of the world that we're not going to abide by the rules. And if we don't abide by the rules, they won't either. And that really does mean that you're walking down this road where, again, the U.S. can be discriminated against just because we're American, or, exports to the United States can be blocked if China wants to do that. So to me, I commend this SAFE report because I think they really worked at trying to give us some trade policy that would stay at least to some degree in that lane. So if we're in that lane, let me just say really quickly, I think there's basically three key components of what it's going to take to get a good critical minerals industry here in the United States. First, I do think it is going to take some protection for our domestic industry while it is developing. I mean, we do not have any mineral processing at all. We have limited mining capacity in many of these minerals, and we are not really all that involved in some of the downstream production. So we need some ability to protect our nascent industry while we're in this process. And the good news is, we can use what is not been very often used, but within our trade remedy rules, our anti-dumping and our countervailing duty laws, is this notion that you can bring a case to protect against the material retardation of an industry about to be developed. So one of the things that could be signaled right out of the box is we're going to go by the rules. We're going to do legitimate anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases based on this, infant industry sort of premise that's in the law already. So that to me is step one, is figuring out a way to protect industry while it's developing. Second is we clearly have to support and provide support for the research and development and the development of the technologies that we need, which means we have to do subsidies. And again, to me, we absolutely can do subsidies completely consistent with our WTO obligations if we don't add on and tack on a number of other things to those subsidy regimes that would violate, like Made in America requirements, local content requirements. And secondly, to me, we have to use those subsidies really strategically. I mean, just yesterday, colleagues at the Council on Foreign Relations released a little paper on sort of how do we, solve the battery problem in the United States. And their suggestion is don't try to put all of your money into lithium-ion batteries. Instead, put all of our subsidies into the next generation of solid state batteries that will be more efficient, safer, et cetera, where we are leapfrogging over the old technology of China and using our subsidies in a very strategic way. The third thing that you're clearly going to need to develop this industry is consistent, strong demand for critical minerals and the components made of them that are built with appropriate high labor and environmental standards. So again, how do we use a trade tool to create that consistent, strong demand? And to me, again, there's a number of ways that you do that. One is you leverage the demand that's available in the United States, which would largely be through our government procurement, our military procurement. I mean, we as a government procured $511 billion worth of stuff last year. If you tie, again, all of that government procurement to clean, green, and critical minerals, you are starting with a significant amount of demand pull in terms of creating that stability and predictability and guarding against what Sarah just said, where the Chinese just all of a sudden flood the market and the price drops out to the point where no one wants to invest. So we need to create that consistent demand. You can secondly do that through the creating of some kind of a critical minerals club, where you're pooling the demand of the European Union and others so that you're creating enough of a large demand market for, again, high labor, high environmental standards agreement. And the third tool that you use in this bucket is standards. I mean, that you write a standard for what does it mean to be allowed to be sold in the US market, and you then apply those standards both domestically and to all of the imports, that you must meet this level of standard for labor conditions, for environmental conditions, and for the conditions under which these critical minerals and the components from them are done. All three of those tools are then consistent with our W2 obligations, but would set us up for developing, again, a strong US-based, critical minerals and battery components and, EV battery component manufacturing industry here in the United States.
Great. And I have some more questions for you, but we also have a few audience questions coming in. Thank you for submitting those. You can continue to do that. So let me go to one of those, actually quite a few questions about this topic.
Anna,
So,
can I jump in really quickly just to
yeah,
comment on
sure.
one thing that Jen said? Just wanted to also emphasize that when it comes to particularly the last 2 points that Jen made, our defense sector, our procurement that we have at home is really a single digit demand pull. So it makes it harder for us to just kind of narrowly put the onus on that procurement lens in changing these supply chains drastically. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it and do it strategically, but just making sure we kind of keep our eyes on the commercial prize. That's really kind of the demand driver here. And it varies for mineral commodity on the sectors that it's applied to. The other thing I would just note is when it comes to the leapfrogging of technology, the innovation that happens on the product line is really, really important here. And so without the ability to actually have scaled industrial capacity today, we won't be able to scale the future of the technologies either. So again, trying to make sure we are taking into consideration what it means to bring manufacturing to the United States, to allied countries, so then when those technologies are ready to be deployed at scale, they have something to actually be deployed on. So just kind of, again, these timing tensions and demand tensions that we need to kind of account for in all of our trade policy or mineral policy considerations.
Great. And actually, Abigail, I did want to ask you. So, one of the issues that the report highlights is the limitations of trade policies. So, are there other complementary policies or actions that you are thinking that the United States can pair with trade measures to help create a more comprehensive strategy for more diverse and more secure critical mineral supplies?
So, and Jen got at one in her third point too. So just to kind of reinforce that we were coming to this conversation kind of being absent from the minerals conversation in a lot of resource rich countries for the last couple of decades, right? So the diplomatic reach and outreach that we've seen from this administration, from the previous administration, is really, really important to build upon so that we can actually get to that commercial movement of goods, of materials westward to, our sourcing transformation countries that are FTA compliant under the IRA 30D tax credit, but then also as much as possible at home. So the Mineral Security Partnership, which, has encompassed the EU raw materials buyers club idea that President von der Leyen had put forward previously, is really trying to do this at the ground level, working with resource-rich, lower-income countries through the MSP Forum, led by DG Trade in Europe, but then also at a project level, which treats the urgent need, led by the United States State Department. The Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment is similarly, taking a really, really important lens around corridor development, because the trade policies here are limited. Giving access to AGOA countries to 30D doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have ready to go projects in the short 10-year timeline of a tax credit, right? We need investment in infrastructure in those countries. We need capacitization of government so that we can make sure that the governance standards are adhered to. And we need to make sure that we're, when appropriate, exporting our, technology that allows for a cleaner way of doing these processes. So that can happen through, the investments we're seeing through PGI, the partnership and engagement, and then projects that we're seeing come out of MSP, but then also just generally through our commercial diplomacy agencies like EXIM Bank and DFC.
Fabulous. Yeah, and please feel free to jump in. So I wanted to ask an audience question. So there are quite a few that pertain to the election, obviously a big topic for everybody right now. One audience member asks, do you see a difference in how a Trump or Harris administration will go about crafting a trade policy for critical minerals? There were also a few questions about the impact of tariffs on the U.S. mineral supply chain. Should Section 301 tariffs on Chinese critical minerals stay in place in the next administration? How should the next administration use or not use tariffs? And then someone else asks, what impacts would an all-out trade war with China have on the global critical minerals sector? A bunch of interesting questions there. I just want to invite anyone to jump in there who'd like to.
Well, I can start maybe just with the tariffs. I mean, part of it is, at this moment in time, tariffs on the minerals themselves are not having any impact because fundamentally we're not importing any minerals because we don't have any processing capacity. So, I mean, whether we do or don't have tariffs on those is largely irrelevant at this moment, until and unless we get a critical minerals processing industry established here in the United States. Second, I do think there would be a significant difference just from what you read in terms of what both campaigns have said about their approach to trade, where I do think, what the Trump administration has said is, an across the board tariff of, 10, 20% on all goods and then 60% tariff on everything from China. Those will have a major effect. Obviously, they will raise the prices for every good sold and will substantially raise the price for any of the critical processed minerals and or components of batteries and goods going into EVs. So again, I think it would be very, very difficult to see how the United States continues to grow its own industry in the wake of those. In other words, I think it would be a major setback in terms of timing. The Harris administration has obviously not removed any of these Trump tariffs, so they're still in place. And from what you hear on the campaign trail, I think their view is that tariffs are to be used much more strategically in a much more targeted way. And we simply don't know whether there's any particular part of this industry that they would see adding tariffs to or removing tariffs from.
Anyone else? Go ahead.
Happy to.
I would, oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry, nope.
Yeah, we'll do Sarah and then Sarah
Lots
and
to
then.
say.
Yeah.
I can jump in really fast, just to say that, I think this begs the question of whether or not we'll see movement towards component tariffs. And I think that that's a fair question on the table, and it's not just unique to critical minerals, but also to chips in a phone, and how we deal with that. But I would say that we have to be super careful, and this comes back to the trade-offs conversation, because to the extent that we have minerals where we are 100% net import reliant, we are going to not have the policy flexibility to move forward to discipline prices and non-market practices and all of that stuff because we don't have an alternative. So, we've got to think through how we can immediately address the most at-risk minerals, in my mind anyway, so that we can reduce those dependencies to give us more policy flexibility to discipline the prices. It's a little bit of a chicken and the egg, but that's going to be some of the, tension that whoever in the next administration is sitting in the Oval Office is going to have to deal with.
What I was going to say really reinforces what Sarah and Jen both said on kind of the timing issue here. A report came out recently saying that the biggest inhibiting factors from investing in minerals in a resource-rich country are lack of infrastructure, financing gap, permitting delays, high capital costs. Short of political risk, you could have told me that could have been Zambia or the DRC, but it was Canada. Canada, who is an ally close to the United States, who promises, this opportunity of supply chain integration and supporting U.S. goals, as well as North American and allied goals for mineral resource security and adhering to high standards. It's going to take time for us to be able to get these alternative sources of supply in the ample amounts that the biggest demand sources like the automotive sector need them. So any type of policy, trade policy, domestic policy needs to be calibrated to adjust for that amount of time. If you cut off existing supply, that does not immediately equal getting the domestic supply, getting the allied secure supply online. We need to get that supply online, make no mistake, but we just need to do so with consideration of what it will take to get those things going. That necessitates domestic policies like permitting reform, but also the capacitization and diplomacy and commercial support that I mentioned before in other countries.
I'll jump into, and there were quite a few elements in the questions you asked, Donna. Just to the China point, like China's already putting export restrictions on graphite, antimony, gallium, germanium, and part of it is whenever the United States takes an action like they did in the semiconductor space for export controls, China responded by implementing its own export controls with respect to some of these critical minerals, and very similar to what they did to the Japanese over a decade ago, which is why Japan has diversified away from China more than a lot of other countries have to date. So this is something that's vexed administrations on a very bipartisan basis. And what I would say in terms of like how this would play out in an election, I would absolutely guarantee that a Trump administration is going to be very focused on the critical mineral challenges. And part of, as Abby outlined, the challenges are domestic, right? Like permitting, trying to work on a state level to get some of these facilities. Like that is a big priority of the Republican Party, is to make government easier, less bureaucratic. And I think you'll see a lot of willingness on a Republican administration to try to address some of those challenges on the early stages of the supply chain. But then on trade policy in particular, my assumption is a Trump administration would take a much bigger swing at this. The Trump administration uses trade policy as one of its top 3 policy tools. And the idea of working with allies to create a club, a critical mineral club or some sort of consortium, or using tariffs as a tool to say, look, if you're in the club and you abide by certain labor standards, environmental standards, you're an allied nation, you're going to face a smoother ride, lower tariffs, easier market access. And if you're out of the club, you're going to face a big wall. Like that is a classic Trump administration strategy that I would very easily see a potential administration pursuing. But either Trump or Harris, I think this is going to continue to be a priority for the United States just because of the real national security implications of our overdependence on China, Russia, and other countries for our critical mineral supply.
Great. Very interesting responses. We did have a few questions relating to environmental impact. Some audience members were asking, how can the circularity of the critical mineral supply be improved? Is there a role for trade policies? Could we think about, kind of a second life mining and recycling program for other countries that are currently used as waste disposal for our electronic devices? And then maybe in a slightly different vein, there was also a question about current thinking and accounting for climate change sustainability targets at a national level and carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Maybe I could invite, just 1 or 2 people to just kind of quickly touch on some environmental issues, and then we'll go to a final round of just a few concluding remarks. Does anyone want to jump in?
Well, I'll only say on the sort of recycling sort of aspects of it, meaning obviously one of the trade tools that we could look at, and obviously, the SAFE report is addressing, is the issue of whether we can put export controls to keep, again, the huge amount of critical minerals that we can pull out of recycled everything. So again, it's on the domestic side to do a much better job of actually, doing the actual work of collecting all of the things that have critical minerals contained in them, and then again of breaking down those so that we end up with, the ability to reuse these critical minerals. I mean, the good news is the vast majority of them are highly recyclable. You can use them over and over again if you put in place the infrastructure. And one of the trade tools that we could use, again, as that, I mean, I'm completely agreeing with Abigail, that a lot of this is all around the timing of it. I mean, we simply cannot do everything unless and until the United States has gotten its own system up and running, and that is going to take time. And so all of these trade tools, we have to think about when and how to employ them in order to give the time that we need to develop. Well, one of the things that we need to develop is our recycling capacity. And one of the ways that you can do that, at least to some degree, get that temporary barrier is whether or not you're putting restraints, export controls, so that you're keeping your recycled material here in the United States while you are developing the ability to process the recycled materials. So that's clearly one of the tools that could be brought to bear, and arguably should be. And in terms of the environment, to me, again, as I said, one of the easy ways to do this is to set clear environmental standards for what do we think is the sort of minimum standards of the environment, and to enforce those through regulations, through standards. Just no critical minerals or components thereof can be sold, marketed, imported, exported, anything else, unless it meets this basic standard. And that is completely consistent with our WTO obligations, could easily be done, again, through a normal, regulatory process of announcing what those standards are.
Okay, great.
Just-
We just have 5 minutes left, so why don't we do a final round? And I'll make the question kind of a bit more general. Are there, other policy tools or approaches that you want to highlight that we could use more effectively? Are there ways we could use existing trade tools or modify or reimagine them to get to that purpose? So maybe that'll allow you to respond to that previous question as well, if you'd like to. So. Any final thoughts? I'd like to go first.
I'm
Sarah?
happy to jump in with two thoughts. One, and this is something that's in the SAFE report and I think is really creative and interesting, and that is thinking about honing in on critical minerals resiliency and the standards associated with it in the way that we have with other environmental issues under FTAs. We spent a lot of time on forestry issues with Peru and with many other of our trading partners. This could be an interesting, kind of modernized version of that. So encourage folks to really read that. That's on page 37 of their report. And so the other thing I would say is we absolutely need a friendshoring framework. Silverado is going to put something out on this, and in our mind, it is creating a transparent way of figuring out who are our friends, what's the data behind it, what can we get out of it, what are the incentives. So if you think about, would a country want to enter into a critical minerals agreement with us? What are the incentives that they would get? Are we entering into these agreements with the right partners in order to get the things that we need? We need a whole rubric for that. That's also going to give some political cover to the policymakers who are choosing who to enter into agreements with. So stay tuned for that.
Great. Just a final few moments. Yeah, Kellyanne?
Sure, maybe I'll jump in. And I highlighted this in one of my earlier interventions. So I completely agree with Sarah for all the talk of nearshoring, onshoring, friendshoring, ally shoring, whatever shoring you want to call it. Supply chains have gotten longer, not shorter, because effectively it's just someone else in between China and the rest of the world. So to my mind, if you want to shorten supply chains, particularly for products that are so sensitive to national security, like certain critical minerals, you have to change the rules of origin, and you have to implement a system whereby the private sector will have to certify that there is no Chinese, Russian, or whatever adversarial content in that supply chain or ownership. Now that's a lot to put on business, right? And a lot of large companies have the resources to do that, to have that transparency, but a lot of small and medium-sized companies don't. So it's going to take a partnership between government and the private sector to do that. But if you do have rules in place that really incentivize you to have alternatives and shorter supply chains, then use the other policy tools you have on a domestic basis, international negotiations, whatever else to help support that effort. I think that's how we solve some of this problem, because if we just leave the rules the way they are, there's not really an incentive for the private sector to get involved and partner with the government on any of these things. So that's where I see a lot of this going, and I'd love to see even like a pilot of this or a test case as part of either the USMCA renegotiation or a group of countries who want to get together and talk about a specific mineral or two and see if they can really form some sort of agreement and some sort of changes to the rules that work for a particular mineral, and then to replicate that on an as needed basis.
And I'll only close by saying, obviously to me, that is the best of all worlds, is to try to create this critical minerals club, if you will, because it does two things that I think are really critical. One is it does create that demand pull for a significant amount of production in the United States and elsewhere of high labor standards, high environmental standards, critical minerals and their components. So that is the first best option, I think, to go to. And it piggybacks on both what Sarah and Kellyanne have just said, which is we have to do that strategically in terms of knowing who should be in that club for what reason and why, and then how do we create these standards. But that is without a doubt the best option. And the second thing I would say, just because I've spoken a lot about tariffs and other trade tools, but the other one that's out there and that is happening everywhere is corporate disclosure requirements. I mean, these disclosures across supply chains. And it's not just, in the US, it's the European Union's corporate social responsibility due diligence directive. It may come if the courts ever, sort of allow the SEC climate related disclosure rules to come into effect. On and on, we are seeing around the world this notion that you have to disclose, the pieces of your supply chain. You have to be able to account for the greenhouse gases that are emitted along your supply chain. You have to be able to show along your supply chain that you have not used forced labor or child labor. That is clearly coming. And so to me, that's the other piece that again, it's not just about critical minerals. It's happening now. And the issue is whether, again, within the critical minerals framework, we can harness the power of those disclosure requirements to get us where we want to go, which is, again, a highly diverse, resilient supply chain of materials that have been made pursuant to high labor and high environmental standards. That's the goal. And to me, disclosure requirements can play a really important role in speeding us along that goal.
Abga?
Yeah, Anna, I'll use this to maybe wrap up the whole webinar since we're at time, starting by just thanking you for incredible moderation and thanking all of our panelists, Sarah, Kelly, and Jen. I couldn't have thought of a more star-studded trade panel, and it was really, really validating and wonderful to hear how aligned you felt the findings of the report were and some of the recommendations. Just to quickly sum up, I think we heard today that there is an opportunity here in the sense that there is not a comprehensive trade policy for minerals. So whatever administration comes in can really rectify that. Trade policy has carrots and sticks for us to not only solve critical mineral security challenges, but also ensure high standards are met, facilitating the race up to the top that we need to see. Timing remains a challenge when it comes to getting abundant sources of secure supply, but also getting access to secondary materials through recycling and circularity initiatives. But also, lastly, when it comes to driving innovation and making sure that innovation is scaled at home or amongst allies. We can do this in a WTO compliant way per Jen, and so important to kind of think of what it means to color within those lines. We must do this with friends and resource-rich countries, as well as the private sector, to actually drive meaningful change in these supply chains. And also importantly, there are non-trade policies that matter here, like permitting reform at home, increasing and supporting domestic incentives, working on capacity building abroad, coordinating with our allies on unilateral action and disclosure requirements, which we just heard. Again, I really want to thank our panelists, but also the Georgetown Trade Lab, as Jen noted, who were integral in this report, and our communications team, Leslie, Jason, Addison, the full Mineral Center team, Jocelyn, Zoe, Katrina, and our many partners who helped inform this, this labor of love, this massive trade policy report. We hope you find it useful, and we thank you again for joining us today.